Welcome back to the channel and part 2 of my review of Benny Morris's 1948, The First Arab-Israeli War. If you haven't seen part 1, I'll put a card for it up in the corner. You don't need to have seen part 1 in order to see this, but it is part of a continuous narrative of the war, which started as a civil war before the Mandate ended in 1947 and concludes with the armistice agreements in 1949. This part is going to take us from that first truce until the armistice agreements. So what is happening during this truce? The Israelis are rearming using Czech weapons against the UN arms embargo, which the British and the French observe, which means the Arabs do not get resupplied. And they bring in a bunch more troops to have these weapons. So now they have not just a superiority in weapons, but they have a superiority in manpower. So even if there was a question about where they were, I think, at the beginning of the war, which was, I think, something like 35,000 Haganah troops versus, let's say, 25,000 Arabs, which was already numerically superior. By the end of this time, the mobilization is around 96,000, so almost 100,000 troops, far outnumbering Arab troops who had not resupplied because they couldn't, and they didn't seem to have the political will to do so. A lot of political infighting. I'll put a card up for The War on Palestine, which is another book that you should be reading if you're going to read Benny Morris's 1948 to get a view of what was happening in the Arab countries. He's focusing very much on what's happening inside in the war, and you're not going to know what's leading to the military decisions on the ground if you don't know what's happening politically in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Lebanon. So make sure that you fill out whatever you learn from this book with other things. So what is the British reaction to this first phase of the war, in which I think the IDF, the Haganah, perform exceptionally well because they were prepared for this war. They were defending their homes, you could say, even though those were not their homes for that long. They were very committed to it, whereas these Arab armies were not committed in the same way. It was an intellectual fight for them. They were not defending their homes. They were defending the homes of Palestinians, potentially, who they didn't always treat very well. And so the reaction of the British to this time period: at the start of the truce, a senior British officer in Haifa predicted that the 4 weeks would certainly be exploited by the Jews to continue military training and reorganization, while the Arabs would waste them feuding over the future division of the spoils. He was right. As one British official subsequently put it, the Arabs lost the initiative throughout Palestine during the 4 weeks, and the Jews were able to re-equip themselves. In his memoirs, Nasser highlighted this by recalling the situation on his front around Isdud. The Israeli side buzzed with activity, while on the Egyptian side there was lethargy, laxity, and laughter. In addition, the Israelis exploited the truce for raiding and occupying sites along the lines that would give them advantage when and if fighting resumed. During the invasion weeks and the first truce, the Yishuv managed to convert its pre-state national institutions rapidly into the agencies and offices of a full-blown state. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the military domain. The Haganah quickly made the transformation from a semi-legal underground militia into a full-fledged army, and by the end of the truce was far stronger in terms of command and control, manpower, and weaponry. The IDF's manpower almost doubled from the 15th of May and the 9th of July, the number in uniform rising from 30 to 35,000 to 65,000. Perhaps as many as 4,000 of the new recruits were veterans of the Allied armies, British, American, Canadian, Czech, of World War II, who came from abroad to help out. Most went home after the war. These veterans included specialists in the crucial specialized branches: sailors, doctors, tank men, logistics and communication experts, air and ground crews. The Israelis also managed to bring in large quantities of arms. By the end of the truce, more than 25,000 rifles, 5,000 machine guns, and more than 50 million bullets had reached the Haganah IDF from Czechoslovakia. During the invasion weeks and the truce, the Haganah IDF also began to receive some of the heavy weapons purchased earlier, principally in the United States and Western Europe. By the end of June, Israel had received and deployed some 30 Swiss-made 20mm cannon. A number of Krupp 75mm cannon also arrived in June. Fighter aircraft trickled in, principally from Czechoslovakia. By the end of July, Israel had received 25 Messerschmitts, though the far more useful Spitfires began to arrive only in late September and into October. By February 1949, Israel had a dozen Spitfires. By mid-July 1948, a number of transport aircraft, some of them committed to combat use, and 3 B-17 bombers had also arrived. So they took advantage of this period. And you can't blame the Israelis for doing this. They were fighting for their lives. They were fighting for this land, and they took it very seriously. The Arabs did not take it as seriously, and that's part of why they lost. Apart from the political infighting, apart from excluding the Palestinians from this process almost entirely. But what is one of the very first things that the Palestinians do, something that the Israelis do, something that they do to this present day and present hour, is establish settlements. The Israelis also use the truce to establish new settlements and begin planning others, mostly on newly conquered territory. Ben-Gurion believed the time was propitious, but cautioned against publicizing these activities. We should speed up settlement, and in more places, and it is possible, but this time we should maintain silence, he told the cabinet. But in fact, the state was hard-pressed on other fronts and devoted few resources to establishing new settlements, Weitz complained. So why keep it secret? If it's moral, if it's legal, if it's something that everyone should acknowledge is right, why keep it a secret? Because they knew that it was wrong, and we're going to see more of this admission later on. Now, the British reaction, there's the Jewish reaction. What is the Arab reaction? Once again, it's total denial. We have Count Bernadotte, who is there sent by the UN, who ends up getting murdered by Jewish terrorists. That's never really talked about, but he was. And he wanted to find a peace for everybody. And he wasn't able to do that, obviously, before he was murdered. Here's more evidence of the Arabs not taking the truce very seriously. Gamal Abdel Nasser, a staff officer, of course we know what Nasser would go on to become later, a staff officer in the 6th Battalion, noted a spirit of indifference and an absence of conviction in the Egyptian preparations. The Egyptian officers seemed to be playing at soldiering, and there was no trace of the authentic fighting spirit. We spent the truce days as though we were in our barracks in Cairo. Our laughter filled the trenches, and our jokes made the rounds throughout the positions, he recalled. But Nasser himself, by his own admission, was behaving no better. He seems to have spent the time recruiting officers to the clandestine Free Officers Organization, which planned and eventually carried out the coup that overthrew the monarchy in 1952, instead of preparing for renewed hostilities. The Arab League's decision on the 6th of July to renew the war formally obligated Abdullah, yet he still hoped to stay out. Just before the start of the 10 days, he secretly informed Israel that he does not wish to fight and that we should not touch him. But Ben-Gurion informed the cabinet we could not accept his proposal as Lydda and Ramla were still in his hands. So, collusion with Abdullah. Abdullah didn't really want to do this. He wanted to annex the West Bank and make that part of Jordan. He had ambitions for a greater Syria, and this was just one of the steps that he wanted to take. The Arabs were still unwilling to accept or recognize Israel's existence. Lebanese Prime Minister Riyad al-Sul told a British diplomat, not for the first time, that it had taken the Arabs over a century to expel the Crusaders, but they succeeded in the end. And Egyptian Foreign Minister Ahmed Mohamed Kashaba said no Arab government could accept a settlement of this kind. In due course, the Arabs would be strong enough to accomplish what was at present impossible owing to military weakness. It wasn't owing to military weakness. It was owing to the lack of cooperation between the Arab nations, because they all had their own individual goals, which only tangentially, really only on paper, was in support of the Palestinians. They had their own goals, which were led around somewhat by public opinion, who said you need to do something about this, but they didn't really necessarily commit, apart from, let's say, individual soldiers and individual people who did die very bravely for the Palestinians for this cause. But realistically, if we took an honest look, the Arabs were delusional Again, referring to Saladin, who was a caliph in charge of a single unified command and control and was a military genius. And they just said, well, because he was a Muslim and he drove the Crusaders out, it's going to be the same thing. Not realizing that history only repeats itself if the circumstances are the same. And there was no Saladin for sure, and there was no unified military command and control. And that's part of why the Arabs lost this war, and they lost it in an enormous way, you could say. Now, we have the policy starting to develop of not allowing the Arabs to return. And this was not entirely clear from cabinet discussions which way it would end up going, but it does end up going one way, and all of this is spoken about. During the truce, the Arabs and Bernadotte pressed Israel to agree to a return of all or some of the refugees. But the Zionist leaders had decided against this. By late summer 1948, a consensus had formed that the refugees were not to be allowed back during the war, and a majority, led by Ben-Gurion and Chertok, believed that it was best that they not return after the war either. The Israelis argued that a discussion of refugee repatriation must await the end of hostilities. In wartime, returnees would constitute a fifth column. But in private, they added that after the war too, if allowed back, returnees would constitute a demographic and political time bomb with the potential to destabilize the Jewish state. That may be true, but you still need to figure out some way of compensating them. That was never on the table. It was just that you all aren't allowed to return back, and that's the end of the story. So they're complaining that the Palestinians never provide a solution, but they never propose a solution, and that's on them. So then they recognized that this was wrong. The onslaught of the armies, which threatened to destroy the Yishuv, left the Israelis with little room for error or humanitarian misgivings. As one local official put it, there are no sentiments in war. Better to cause them injustice than that we suffer a disaster. We have no interest in their returning. Weitz, Danin, and Sasson submitted a 3-page proposal, Retroactive Transfer, a scheme for the solution of the Arab question in the State of Israel. Maybe a final solution? To Ben-Gurion. The document set out the means: destruction of abandoned villages and fields, Jewish settlement of Arab sites, prevention of Arab cultivation, help in the orderly settlement of refugees in Arab countries, by which a return was to be prevented. Indeed, the transfer committee, led by Weitz and using JNF equipment — remember the JNF is the Jewish National Fund — in summer 1948, off its own bat, leveled about half a dozen villages. The cabinet discussed the issue on 16 June. In speech after speech, with Ben-Gurion and Chertok setting the tone, the ministers spoke against refugee repatriation. "I believe we must prevent their return at all costs," said Ben-Gurion, adding, "I will be for them not returning also after the war." Chertok agreed. Had anyone arisen among us and said that one day we should expel all of them, that would have been madness. But if this happened in the course of the turbulence of war, a war that the Arab people declared against us, and because of Arab flight, then that is one of those revolutionary changes after which the clock of history cannot be turned back. The aggressive enemy brought this about, and the blood is on his head, and all the lands and the houses are spoils of war. All this is just compensation for the Jewish blood spilled for the destruction of Jewish property. This assumes that Israel is fighting against the Palestinians who were constituted by their own government. But as we know from studying the Mandate, the Jews deliberately led British policy to not recognize any Palestinian institution. So there was never a Palestinian state, Palestinian polity, which could potentially negotiate with the Jews. Instead, what happened was this speaking for the Palestinians while not coordinating with the Palestinians. You have these Arab armies invading while not giving command and control to a Palestinian, but to King Abdullah, who was really a command and control only in name. All the forces ended up working autonomously and not coordinated, and often refused reinforcing each other due to national problems. So this idea that it's against one, I mean, if you're going to follow that argument from Chertok, then the idea is all of these different countries are then fair game. You can go and invade them, and they would. They invaded Lebanon, they invaded Egypt, because that's the idea. If you declare war on us, then we're going to invade your country and take more land. But that's not always the case in war. the case in war is defensive, right? Especially in the Christian conception. Just war is a defensive war. It's not an offensive war. So you have to defend yourself. But the idea isn't, oh, well, because it's war and all bets are off, we're now going to invade and occupy your places and expel everybody. And had the Jews, let's say, conducted their war in a more just manner, they would have a lot fewer problems today. They just couldn't take the fact that there were going to be Arabs living in their state. They had to expel them, and they admitted to being unjust. And they said that's just war, and you can cry about it all you want, but we're not going to let anybody back, and that's okay. So, what else was going on during this time? Because all we hear is about how terrible Hamas is. The reality is, Morris tells us that it was not purely a noble war. After the war, the Israelis tended to hail the purity of arms of its militiamen and soldiers, and to contrast this with Arab barbarism, which on occasion expressed itself in the mutilation of captured Jewish corpses, which was true. This reinforced the Israelis' positive self-image and helped them sell the new state abroad. It also demonized the enemy. In truth, however, the Jews committed far more atrocities than the Arabs and killed far more civilians and POWs in deliberate acts of brutality in the course of 1948. This was probably due to the circumstance that the victorious Israelis captured some 400 Arab villages and towns during April through November of 1948, whereas the Palestinian Arabs and ALA failed to take any settlements, and the Arab armies that invaded in mid-May overran fewer than a dozen Jewish settlements. Which is an interesting argument. Morris says part of why you didn't see so many atrocities on the Arab side is because they didn't take as many villages. So there's more opportunity. And I could see that. Mathematically, there's more. But you have to say you could still conduct yourself well in war, and we have examples of that. And he does give examples in the text, actually, of both Arabs shielding Jewish soldiers, Zionist soldiers, from attacks from civilians after they'd surrendered. The Israelis' collective memory of fighters characterized by purity of arms is also undermined by the evidence of rapes committed in conquered towns and villages. About a dozen cases in Jaffa, Acre, and so on are reported in the available contemporary documentation, and this is only what Morris was allowed to see. And given Arab diffidence about reporting such incidents, and the understandable silence of the perpetrators, and IDFA censorship of many documents, more, and perhaps many more cases probably occurred. Arabs appear to have committed few acts of rape. Again, this is explicable in terms of their general failure to conquer Jewish settlements. So, again, mathematically, he says that, but the reality is what the numbers are. Altogether, the 1948 war was characterized in relative terms by an extremely low incidence of rape, as contrasted with, for example, the Soviet Army's conquest of Prussia and Eastern Germany in 1945, or the recent Balkan Wars. So he's not excusing the Israelis. He says there were many atrocities and there was a lot of rape. Whether the fact that there was a larger sample size, so there was more chance for atrocity and more chance for rape, doesn't change the fact that, remember, the narrative always from the Zionist side is that the Palestinians are human animals. Look at what these animals do. And they forget that they're great heroes of 1948 acted in this animalistic manner, but they're forgiven because they're Jewish, and remember, they're better than everyone else, and they're allowed to do these things. So the Goyim. The Goyim's main job is to simply submit to the Zionists. That's our main role in life, is just do whatever they tell us to do. As you can tell, I am not one of those people. I serve a higher master. So more of the cleansing, the ethnic cleansing that is going on. Remember that for whatever reason, Morris calls Pape a liar historically because Pape envisions conversations that could have happened that he's pieced together from diaries. And so Morris calls that lying when Pape just explains that, well, if I'm not in the room, I can try to construct it. And he says it in the text. He says, I'm trying to construct how this conversation may have went from the diaries. Perhaps the most extensive rear area second truce cleansing operation was carried out by Givati in the sand dunes around Yibna, Yibna is the Hebrew name. The Arab name is Sukrir. Nabi Rubin, just north of the Egyptian lines. The operation was named Mitzvah Nikayon, Operation Cleaning. Armed units were to be destroyed and unarmed civilians expelled. The operation was mounted on the 28th of August Shacks and huts were torched, 10 Arabs were killed, 3 were injured, and 3 were captured. Many others probably fled as the IDF approached. 20 cows, camels, and mules were also killed. So they wanted to make sure that the Palestinians couldn't come back and use these animals for food or for transportation. Can you imagine? These are terrorist cows. The 20 cows, camels, and mules, terrorist cows murdered. The refugees were from Zarnuka, Yibna, and Kabiba, and were trying to harvest their fields. The hunger rampant among the refugees forces them to endanger themselves and penetrate our area, stated the IDF report. Imagine being so hungry that you have to come back to your home that's being occupied to try to harvest the fields, potentially at night, and then potentially get killed. Perhaps the most important measure was the near systematic destruction of villages after conquest and depopulation. While 2 villages, Arab Sukrir and Kisaria, had been demolished by Haganah troops in January and February 1948, the start of a policy of demolition can be pinpointed to the first half of April, when Haganah units involved in Operation Nashon and in the battle around Mishmar HaEmek were ordered to level the villages after conquest. We intend to destroy the villages when we leave them, a Golani unit fighting around Mishmar HaEmek informed Carmeli and Golani HQs on 9 April. That day, the Palmas 1st Battalion demolished the village Gubaya al-Fawqa. My apologies to my Arabic speakers. My Arabic is clearly atrocious. The next day, Haganah troops occupied and blew up 30 houses in Al-Kafrin and additional houses in Abu Zurik and Abu Shusha. The last houses in Abu Zurik, a large village northwest of Mishmar HaEmek, were destroyed on 14th of April. So this is Morris documenting that what was happening was a demolition and expulsion of these villages. Whenever conditions make it necessary, the new settlement should be established on the site of the existing village. The idea of keeping or leaving aside surplus land for returnees was now abandoned. So there's actually an interim period in which the Israelis entertained the idea that the Arabs might return and that they would have some land for them. And then at some point they said, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep this all for ourselves. It's a lot easier. Remember, you've looted all their houses already. Anyway, how are you going to explain that? A Mapam activist later wrote a complaint quoting an officer who had reached the village a day or so later. The first wave of conquerors killed about 80 to 100 male Arabs, women, and children. One commander ordered a sapper to put 2 old women in a certain house and blow it up. The sapper refused. The commander then ordered his men to push in the old women, and the evil deed was done. One soldier boasted that he had raped a woman and then shot her. Now, also, Morris gives counterexamples in which this wasn't always the case, right? So I would say from what he seems to indicate, 80 to 85 to 90% of the time, this is exactly what happened. But 10% of the time, people were allowed to stay, I think very famously in Nazareth. It seemed that the ALA had antagonized the inhabitants, and they were very happy to see them go and very happy to have the Israelis come. So it wasn't uniform. But here's an example of an example. Sorry, an example of an example. Here's a counterexample. At Isdud, originally a town of 5,000 inhabitants, the Israelis found a few hundred people who greeted them with white flags and asked for permission to stay. Permission was granted, and a sergeant, one Sasson Gottlieb, was appointed governor. But Southern Command then reversed itself and ordered the inhabitants to leave. A similar pattern seems to have been followed at Hamama, a large refugee-filled village to the south. But Givati behaved inconsistently. A week later, at Majdal, the conquering Givati unit found in place fewer than 1,000 of the town's original 10,000 inhabitants. The rest had fled. Their elders asked to surrender and stay. And here, contrary to precedent, inexplicably, the troops allowed the population to remain, even hanging on the walls posters cautioning soldiers against looting and improper behavior. The IDF sent patrols to the surrounding dunes and groves to beckon those hiding there to return home. You read that, you're like, wow, you can't believe it. But it's a testimony to humanity, to justice, that not all Zionists acted this way, that some actually acted with a little bit of justice, with a little bit of compassion, with a little bit of humanity. And Morris gives us that example throughout the text as well. When it happens, he documents it, and I appreciate that. Hundreds streamed back to town, but during the following weeks, about 500 non-local refugees were identified and expelled. By 1950, the town contained more than 2,000 Arabs, alongside Jewish settlers who had begun to move in during 1949. So we get to peace, which realistically is just an armistice. It's not a peace treaty. We wouldn't see the peace treaty until the late 70s with Sadat and Begin. And even then, there's so many ways that can be talked about as a total disaster, and we'll get to that later. Right now, let's stick with 1948. Israel's leaders understood that an agreement with the Egyptians was crucial, of far-reaching importance in Walter Eitan's phrase, in paving the way for similar agreements with the other belligerents. Politically, demographically, economically, and culturally, Egypt was the key Arab country. If it didn't sign, none would, leaving Israel embattled and mobilized, with the problem reverting to the UN Security Council for debate and resolution. The council would not necessarily rule in Israel's favor. An agreement with Cairo was seen as crucial to Israel's acceptance in the Middle East and in the international community. It was not yet a member of the United Nations. David Ben-Gurion well understood these contradictory perspectives. And remember, Ben-Gurion has said before, if he had been born an Arab, he would have joined a terrorist organization. As he told his colleagues against the backdrop of the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, we must see the situation for what it is. On the security front, we are those attacked and who are on the defensive. But in the political field, we are the attackers and the Arabs are those defending themselves. They are living in the country and own the land, the village. We live in the diaspora and want only to immigrate to Palestine and gain possession of the land from them. Years later, after the establishment of Israel, he expatiated on the Arab perspective in a conversation with the Zionist leader Nahum Goldman. I don't understand your optimism. Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make peace with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel, it's true, but 2,000 years ago. And what is that to them? There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? That is coming from David Ben-Gurion. He, as I've said before, is someone I just come to grudgingly admire as a great leader and crucial to the formation of Israel. Without David Ben-Gurion, I don't know that things turn out the way that they do for the Israelis. And here he's being honest. If I were an Arab, I would do this and I would never make peace. So, in the last stage of the book, last chapter, is titled Some Conclusions. And Morris here decides to insert his own opinions. And that's fine. It's his book. He's entitled to do that after going through and giving us all this research. He's perfectly entitled to give us his opinions. I just want to probably give you some of my own thoughts on his opinions. The Palestinian Arabs, along with the rest of the Arab world, said a flat no, as they had in 1937 when the Peel Commission had earlier proposed a two-state solution. The Arabs refused to accept the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of Palestine, and consistently with that no, the Palestinian Arabs in November through December 1947 and the Arab states in May 1948 launched hostilities to scupper the resolution's implementation. Many Palestinians may have been unenthusiastic about going to war, but to war they went. They may have been badly led and poorly organized. The war may have been haphazardly unleashed, and many able-bodied males may have avoided service. But Palestinian Arab society went to war, and no Palestinian leader publicly raised his voice in protest or dissent. However, he says this after documenting over and over the number of Palestinian civilian villages that were dynamited and killed. Were they filled with arms? Were they leading a resistance against the Zionist invader? The idea that Palestinian Arab society went to war, there were some Palestinians who went to war, but this was mostly a war led by outside nations, allegedly on behalf of Palestine. Palestine had not been allowed to politically organize because of terms that the Yishuv and the Zionists imposed on the British, leading from the Balfour Declaration throughout the British Mandate. So while the reason that the Arabs said no, 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 no is because they saw this injustice and they couldn't live with it. They couldn't live with the injustice and they couldn't find a way to a compromise. It's easy to look back in hindsight and say, you all should have seen what was going on and found a way to compromise with the Jews, even though it was unjust, because sometimes peace requires an acceptance of injustice. That's been seen throughout history. It's easy for us to say that now. But you have to give a lot of compassion and understanding that the Arabs just saw this as an ongoing injustice. And they thought, well, if we just make our case to the world will see this injustice. And they were proven to be really naive about that. The world saw the injustice and they went along with whatever the Zionists told them to do. And that continues to this present day. He said the Palestinian Arabs with well-established traditions of disunity, corruption, and organizational incompetence failed to mobilize their resources. Again, this was collusion. Part of the reason, I'm not saying that Professor Khalidi talks about this in The Iron Cage. The Palestinians have to take some blame for this themselves. But he doesn't at all acknowledge that part of this disunity and part of this corruption and part of this incompetence was due to the unwillingness of the British to invest in Palestinian education, the education of Arab children, to a greater extent. They were unwilling to allow the Palestinians to have a representative body, and they imposed the will of a minority population, a settler colonialist population, which they sponsored. And unlike every other mandatory country from the League of Nations era, Palestine was not allowed to be self-determined by a majority population. This was unjust. This is again from Morris. The Palestinians, like the surrounding Arab states, had a socio-economic elite with no tradition of public service or ethos of contribution and sacrifice. Typical was the almost complete absence of sons of that elite among the fighters of 1936 to 1939 and 1948. For many, nationalism was a rhetorical device to amass power or divert resentments rather than a deeply felt emotion. The Palestinian Arabs suffered from a venal leadership and a tradition of imperial domination, as well as a sense of powerlessness and fatalism. These combine to neuter initiative. I think a lot of that is true, but it seems to indicate that the counter to that is that the Zionists had this great tradition, but Jews did not have a tradition of public service. Everything that he's talking about, ethos of contribution, sacrifice, nationalism, this was all very recent. It was invented by Herzl and then nurtured by the Zionists who came there. So he's trying to claim as a counterexample that, this is what it's true. The Yishuv had it, but it wasn't from some longstanding tradition. It was invented. And the Palestinians could have had that as well if they were allowed to organize themselves. But they were stonewalled by the British, and that stonewalling was encouraged by the Yishuv. As in subsequent wars in October 1973 and in June 1982, the successive UN ceasefire standstill resolutions prevented a clear Israeli victory and saved the Arabs from even ever greater humiliations. Morris wants Israel to conquer even more land. It's not enough what they have. And it was great power and UN pressure and intercession that afforded the Egyptians and Syrians face-saving terms in the armistice agreements of 1949. Face-saving terms. Without these intercessions, it is likely that the talks both with Egypt and with Syria would have broken down and hostilities would have been renewed, ending in further Arab defeats and loss of territory. As it was, the agreements eventually reached assured the Arab states of the retention of some territory inside Palestine, the Gaza Strip, and of demilitarized strips in which neither side was sovereign. And in those demilitarized zones, if you didn't know what the status quo was, Arab towns were patrolled by Arab police and Jewish towns were patrolled by Jewish police, but nobody claimed sovereignty over that area. This was an interesting fact that I didn't know about. This was during negotiations in 1949 and in Switzerland. The Arabs demanded that Israel accept the November 1947 partition borders as the basis for negotiation. Israel refused because they wanted more land. And as Noam Chomsky has said, Israel is always going to choose war over security. They're always going to choose expansion over security. They're always going to choose land over security. Remember the early Zionists, they want not just the West Bank, they want the East Bank. Ze'ev Jabotinsky wants something from the Nile to the Euphrates. They're not interested in security. They're interested in expansion. That's what Zionism wants. A belated Israeli offer in July to take back 100,000 refugees. I couldn't believe when I read this. Actually, 65,000 plus those who had already illegally or legally returned to Israeli territory, if the Arab states agreed to settle the rest on their territory. was rejected out of hand. That's an interesting proposition, and one that I think potentially the Arabs should have gone a little further to after getting their ass handed to them in this war. But it was rejected out of hand because in their mind, they were going to rearm and they were going to crush the Zionist invader. Total delusion and total departure from reality, because they were going to be like Saladin and they were going to drive the Crusaders out, not realizing it was a different enemy and they weren't Saladin. Israel, for its part, turned down an American proposal that had taken about 250,000 refugees. Nothing happened, and in September, the delegations went home. The next bout of serious Israeli-Arab peacemaking occurred almost 30 years later after Sadat's astonishing visit to Jerusalem in November 1977. Part 2. So I hope you enjoyed that. Benny Morris's 1948, the First Arab-Israeli War. If you enjoyed this, please hit like, subscribe, share this video with someone who's open-minded, willing to hear what an Israeli has to say about the Arab-Israeli War. If you want to show your appreciation, please send a super thanks. If you really, really want to show your appreciation, you can become a patron, get access to these videos early. You can also become a member on YouTube. Remember that a portion of the proceeds of these videos, including, let's say, buying a copy of the book, which is linked in the description below, will go to support in 2024 the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides medical care to children in Palestine who couldn't otherwise receive it. If you are interested, you can also potentially buy a book from my Amazon wish list, which, as I have said before, is probably going to be looking at 2025 at this point, just because I have so many books that I need to cover in 2024 regarding Israel and Palestine. But if you'd like to support the channel, that's one way that you can do that. As always, enjoy your reading.